Hello and welcome to the North Country. We're delighted that you've chosen to spend some time getting to know the North Country and exploring the possibilities of service in the North Country. I'm Tony Poekert. I'm the Director of Parish and Community Outreach for New Hampshire Catholic Charities. And I'd like to talk to you today about two arenas. One is North Country culture, and the other is understanding the culture of poverty, because these are two cultures that you will in fact intersect with during your experience in the North Country. Now, before we get started on either of those topics, I'd like to do a little bit of background on culture itself. What is culture? Culture has often been defined as a congruent set of behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or among professionals and enable that system, agency, or professionals to work effectively together. Pretty complex definition, but let's look at an example. Now, you probably have all had the experience where you've entered a room where the people in the room are very different from yourselves, and you've had that sense of discomfort. At that moment, you've been somewhat culturally ineffective. And in those situations, we sometimes exercise the greatest caution not to do or say something that might cause others to take offense. And in that moment, we're not quite ourselves. Cultural effectiveness is just the opposite of that. It's being able to come into a situation that you're not familiar with and immediately be able to engage with the people in that arena. Cultural effectiveness has replaced the old term of cultural competence. Cultural competence implies that there is some end to achieve. Cultural effectiveness is much more fluent. And probably the best definition of cultural effectiveness comes from my consultant, Okadin Udo, who says to be culturally effective does not mean that you're an authority on the values and beliefs of every culture. It would be impossible to amass that much knowledge. What it does mean is that you hold a deep respect for culture and a deep respect for personal differences, and are eager to learn and willing to accept with great humility that there's more than one way of looking at the world. And if we can grasp that basic definition, to recognize with deep humility and great respect that there's many ways of looking at the world, then we're going to be a culturally effective person. So in the confines of those definitions, let's take a look at North Country culture and why this is important. I first began my journey with North Country culture about 20 years ago. The New Hampshire Bureau of Behavioral Health was engaged in a statewide project called the Community Alliance Reform Effort. It was a program that brought together multiple providers to take a look at families having children with severe emotional disturbance and attempted to create a system of care that put families at the center of that system. The systems of care were mandated by federal regulations to be family-centered and culturally effective. At that point in time, no one was quite sure what culturally effective might be, and cultural competence consultants were hired for the regions that were covered by the project. I became the cultural competence consultant for the North Country. As we began to explore best practices that were surfaced throughout the nation, I quickly began to sense that many of the best practices didn't quite fit in the North Country. And I consistently found myself being a voice at meetings saying, well, that's not going to work in the North Country. And I would be questioned why. And my typical response was, well, things are different in the North Country. And exasperated, my colleagues would say, well, how are they different? Define it. Tell us. We want to know. We want to be able to understand. We did not want to be so disrespectful as to be the sole authority on North Country culture. but we did want to define it and be able to answer some of those questions. And we began a year-long process of doing focus groups that brought together parents, educators, service providers, teenagers, senior citizens, and in each of those groups we asked a very specific set of questions to try to define what North Country culture was. The focus group invitations basically invited people to say, this is who we are and this is how we are. And if you want to work with us, you need to know and understand us a little bit better. Now, by the time we were finished, there were over 800 people interviewed in approximately 35 different focus groups. And what I'm going to do now is present some of the data that we discovered in those groups. Bear in mind that this is not scientifically accurate or validated information. It's simply North Country folks sharing their experiences and examining what the North Country looked like and what the North Country means to them. The very first question we asked people is, how would you describe the region? And what we found was many of the definitions were opposites of each other, and we were astounded by that at first. But as we began to hear them over and over again, we did recognize that many of these opposites are in fact true of the experience of living in the North Country. The most frequently used words to describe our region were unique, cold, and in this particular winter with many 20 below zero mornings, we can appreciate that. Safe, old, rugged, sheltered, historic, sad, rural, beautiful, isolated, independent, and depressing. And if you take the time to drive around the North Country and really observe both the settings and the people, you will in fact see that all of those are true, even when they appear to be opposites. Once folks define the region, we ask them to define the people of the region. What are folks like in the North Country? And again, we heard words that on the surface appear to be opposites, but both are true and do reflect the spirit of the North Country. Those words that we heard most frequently were trusting, strong-willed, self-reliant, generous, high alcohol use, respectful drivers, provincial, high teen pregnancy, hardworking, private, resilient, open to new people, but resistant to change, rigid, a growing elderly population, a high dropout rate, independent, prideful, friendly, courteous, sometimes judgmental, and sheltered. Again, a range of many descriptors, but I think elements of them fit the character and the soul of most North Country people. And bear in mind that those characteristics that sometimes can interfere with forming relationships were the ones that were most frequently mentioned, especially things like strong-willed, self-reliant, independent. And while there are some negative connotations to those characteristics, there's also many positive characteristics related to those indicators. And we'll talk a little bit more about those when we get to implications for service based on these definitions.